Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Please find out more about our Tuesday morning group coalition. That's a monthly meeting of great minds discussing public policy in Virginia. Go to virginiainstitute.org. Welcome back to the program. Director of the Freedom Works Center for Economic Freedom, John Tamny, for more than just a discussion about where we are economically. He's got a brand new book out, When Politicians Panicked, the new coronavirus expert opinion and tragic lapse of reason. John, welcome back. How are you doing, sir?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Is that really what it is? I always try to boil it down to the simplest. Was this really like Mel Brooks saying we've got to protect our phony baloney jobs, and this was our coronavirus response?
I think history books will just say that this was this weird lapse of reason where the world lost its collective mind. Let's never forget that it wasn't just the United States that tried to commit economic suicide. It happened around the world. I'll never understand, and historians will marvel, that politicians chose economic desperation as the fight against a virus when it's remembered that economic growth has always been the biggest enemy of death and disease, and poverty the biggest killer man has ever known.
Mm-hmm.
Yet they flipped the script in 2020 with disastrous consequences for those with the least.
Well, and you raise a great point because economically it drives us to find better medical treatments and ways to deal with viruses if it's imperative that we keep our customers coming in. We don't want our customers to get sick. We don't want our employees to get sick. We need all of those people. So economically speaking, if you tell us all to go home, well, then we'll just wait for you to tell us when it's time to come out.
Yeah, it cannot be stressed enough that in poor countries, life is very cheap. That's the reverse in rich countries because economic growth produces the resources that gives us answers to that which used to kill us. Let's never forget in the 19th century, if you broke your femur, you had 1 in 3 chances of death. But if you lived, your only option was amputation. If you broke your hip, you were going to die. When you were born in the 20th century, you had as good of a chance of dying as you did living. If you got cancer in the 19th century, you were going to die. But see, most people never got to cancer because pneumonia and tuberculosis got them first. And so what changed? Why is healthcare so much less primitive today? Well, it is because economic growth, people like John D. Rockefeller, the richest man who ever lived, in his lifetime alone gave away $450 million to medical research to come up with answers to that which used to kill us.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's essential for us to remind everyone that growth is the answer. That always solves the problem of bad health. Yet this time they chose economic contraction.
It's amazing, to watch how we've treated this, and there's a part of me that wistfully is watching the world say, without Joe Biden's approval, or the administration or the World Health Organization's approval, start saying, you know what, we're going to go back to what we were doing, and when you're ready to say it's okay, otherwise and I think in some cases they're basically saying, come arrest us if you want to, but we're going back to life.
Well, it's no question. What you describe is exactly what's happened, even in places like California. In Carlsbad, California, in the midst of the lockdowns, finally the restaurant owners and bar owners basically said, we've got a choice. We can either go out of business or we can break the law. So they put up signs, we are peacefully protesting. And they reopened and they let people in. And you think about what Joe Biden said. He said a couple weeks ago, maybe by July 4th, small family gatherings can happen. Wait, what?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The president picked the wrong people to lock down. The American people descend from the people who crossed oceans and borders, desperate for a taste of freedom. You do not lock the American people down. And it's a message we all need to send to the president that we've been having barbecues and gathering this whole time. We never stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that he would presume to tell us how to live our lives and tell us that he is going to dictate what we do so that we can remain safe as though we need him to continue living. It's just so insulting what the political class thought they could foist on us, and we need to tell the story over and over again, and also express our independence by living our lives without regard to what they want.
Was this a global capitulation to China, who, whatever the reason it started there, this is where the cases began, and they seem to just chug on along, making masks for the rest of the world, making ventilators for the rest of the world, and it seemed like China is the big winner in all this economically.
Well, I don't think it is, and the reason I don't think it is because why? If the Chinese came up with this, well, what are we afraid of? Wait, a meek virus that the New York Times kept pointing out that at least in elite was largely confined to very sick, very elderly people in nursing homes.
Mm-hmm.
So that on its own has me skeptical that it was a China thing. I also don't want it to. I think making it about China lets politicians off the hook.
Oh yeah,
the
yeah.
reality
No.
is we didn't have to give in. We didn't have to destroy our economy to fight a virus. One of the reasons the Chinese got back to life so quickly, that's been speculated, is the virus has been spreading for months there, which means it has been spreading for months in the United States. And because the politicians there dithered for so long, they achieved a high level of immunity unwittingly. They didn't know. Again, people lived their lives with the virus spreading and never gave it a second's thought. And so I refuse to accept this notion. If the U.S. economy contracts, so will China's economy contract. And I would say the reverse. A growing Chinese economy is great for the U.S. economy. So I just reject the notion that it was China, the world capitulating to China. No, our politicians panicked.
When they act so discordantly, and one week say masks, next week say no masks, one week say hydroxychloroquine, next week, don't take that or you'll die, and so, random and all designed to kind of keep people inside their homes, eventually that becomes a fertile soil, doesn't it, John?
I don't think so. And again, I recognize that there's going to be disagreement here, but I refuse to accept the notion that the politicians are skillful enough to band together and have this basic conspiracy. Okay, we're going to get together and we're going to harm our people.
Mm-hmm.
I think politicians legitimately believe this. I think politicians also legitimately believe that they get into it because they want to do things. Politicians exist to spend. They exist to do something. And so they saw a chance to be heroes. Okay, we're going to get together and save you. And so to me, this is just more evidence that politicians are incredibly arrogant, that they think without them, we can't get by, so let us guide you. And so I think what happened is, they were terrified. They listened to experts who had a lot of bad information, and they wildly overreacted. Having overreacted and needlessly destroyed tens of millions of jobs and millions of businesses, they then decide, well, we can't admit how wrong we got it, so we're going to continue the charade. And guess what? We will go to the federal government to get the money to subsidize the lockdowns to continue the charade so that we don't have to admit how stupendously wrong we got this. To me, that's the bigger story. But again, the history is still being written.
John Tamny is on with us, Director of Freedom Works Center for Economic Freedom, author of a new book, When Politicians Panicked. And John, I want to kind of go into the second edition of When Politicians Panic, because right now we're watching, everything has been relabeled infrastructure. It's amazing to me. Oh yeah, no, your neighbor's infrastructure. What? So we're going to invest in infrastructure and send your neighbor $5,000. Is it trillions of dollars are flowing out of Washington in ways that, just 10 years ago, millions of dollars would have freaked out most economics professors. Where are we going economically with this kind of subsidization nation?
It's a very unfortunate thing to think about, the level of government spending. What was that Randolph Bourne said long ago, that war is the health of the state? Well, I argue, and when politicians panic, that economic crises are the state's oxygen because they give politicians an excuse to spend and spend wildly. We'll extract $2.9 trillion sometime last April or so to basically subsidize the lockdowns for politicians to throw money at all their mistakes. Another $1.9 trillion a couple of weeks ago, and now infrastructure. Let's never forget there's no such, and I point this out in the book regularly, there's no such thing as government spending. There's just politicized allocation of wealth, always and everywhere created in the private sector. So government spending, all it is Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy and Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell centrally planning the allocation of resources that, if not allocated by government officials, would be deployed in the private sector, pushed to their highest use in the private sector. So government spending cannot drive economic growth simply because government spending is a creation of economic growth. Yeah. Without the growth, governments couldn't spend. So to pretend as they do that all this infrastructure spending is going to boost the economy is a monument to double counting. No, the growth occurred, politicians took their percentage of it and are now spending it. For them to say that this will create new economic growth presumes that Nancy Pelosi is better at allocating resources than Jeff Bezos or Fred Smith of FedEx or Peter Thiel. The very notion is laughable.
Well, is it borrowing from Peter, in advance to pay Paul now? I mean, because it seems like we're getting an advance on our allowance. A lot of this money is coming on the hopes of future economic activity.
Well, here's the problem with prosperity. I mean, you're right. Politicians, when they spend, when they borrow, they're borrowing from existing growth, and they're also borrowing from the future. Mm-hmm. And so what the markets are saying is that the U.S. is a good credit risk, that the U.S. can borrow in enormous amounts, and investors will allow them to borrow at very low interest rates. It's a reminder of how productive the American people are, that investors will lend to the government so much, but consider always the unseen. Yes, it's a signal of a lot of economic growth in the future that we can borrow this much, but imagine how much bigger the economy would be if politicians weren't extracting so much precious wealth from it. The spending is always a burden, whether the money is taxed away or borrowed. Now, again, politicians can borrow and tax a lot from the most dynamic economy in the world, but this never redounds to our prosperity. It never adds to economic growth. The unseen always has to be considered. How much richer of a nation we would be, how much better our jobs would be, how much more they would pay if government weren't consuming so much of the wealth that we create.
John, speaking of that, and you've segued right into my next question. So the president is getting set to unveil a massive capital gains tax increase, and I bracketed it on my local show as the 70s called and want their tax policy back. It's almost like an homage to Walter Mondale upon his passing. But this is, they demagogue the 5,000 or 6,000 families that I think the chief economic advisor said, it's only 5,000 or 6,000 families this is going to impact. Well, if that's true, it's not going to generate enough money. And we know it's not true because really who's going to pay this millionaire tax are businesses that make $1 million or $2 million a year and are proprietorships, because that's how the owners of those businesses are paying their taxes. So they're going to get hammered. These are the small businesses that we just closed down.
Well, they're going to get hammered, and let's stress that the most important people of all to economic growth are the 5,000 or 6,000 families that they're talking about.
Right, they're the investors.
There are no entrepreneurs. There are no businesses without capital. Who creates new businesses? Rich people who have lots of unspent wealth. That is the only way for a new entrepreneurial idea to become reality. It's the only way for an existing business to expand is if they can borrow, if they can attain precious capital from the private sector. So when you tax the richest of all, you're taxing the very individuals who have the most wealth to direct to existing and future entrepreneurs. If you give me a tax cut, I'm largely going to spend it. which means I can't drive a lot of economic growth. Investment is what drives economic growth. So a higher capital gains tax is a higher penalty on the very savings and investment that drives out all economic progress. So you're right. It's the 70s calling for its economy back. It's a call for a return to malaise. Will the U.S. economy still grow? Look, Americans are enormously innovative. But think how much more they could grow if we weren't penalizing the savings and investment that drives all economic progress.
Why, John, does it seem like the federal government and in smaller degrees the state governments feel like they should be the venture capital firm of record rather than having us look for a disruptor capital or some other hedge fund that might, lend the money, a Shark Tank kind of thing? It seems like the governments of our states and the federal government would rather fill that role as the capitalist firm, and then they get to approve or disapprove of whatever businesses come along.
Oh, yeah. Look, politicians exist to spend. They love to be the allocator, the doler out of funds to businesses, but they quite simply cannot be. And it's something that I stress over and over again in the book. Governments cannot be investors precisely because the failure mechanism that real venture capitalists always deal with isn't there. Mm-hmm. The reality is that most startups out in Silicon Valley fail, something on the order of 90%. Mm-hmm. Imagine that with government. Government can't be an investor because government mistakes never end. They continue to throw money at that which doesn't work. In fact, what's not working attracts more money. It attracts more employees. Whereas in the private sector, we're constantly trying to do more with less. Mm-hmm. And so as a rule, government cannot be an investor because government is constrained by the known. Entrepreneurs and venture capitalists are trying to rush forward the future in unknown. They're trying to rush the future into the present. Governments cannot do that. And so when they presume best, they do no such thing. They give us, at best, stasis.
John Tamny, Director of FreedomWorks Center for Economic Freedom. The book is When Politicians Panic. So, John, in the few minutes we have left, how do we, pardon the phrase, inoculate ourselves from letting this happen? Or are the American people, especially the parents of public school children, starting to realize, hey, why were we trusting these people to do this all along? I sense there's a renewed vigor in the school choice movement. I sense that there's a renewed vigor in libertarianism and don't ask the government for any help because they're going to fail. Do you sense the same thing?
I hope you're right. One of the positives that, if there can be, that will hopefully emerge from these lockdowns is that people are wise to just how much governments can damage things in short order. So hopefully they'll never trust them again. But you ask an essential question, how can we avoid this in the future? And to be clear, there will be viruses in the future that reach the United States. Mm-hmm. And we know that as a consequence of that, experts will go to easily gulled politicians and say, this time is different. This virus is hitting young people pretty hard, so we've got to lock down. We've got to take away freedom. And that's why the last chapter of the book makes as best case I can that if we make this a debate about numbers, about statistics, we will win the battle but lose the war. We have got to make this a freedom discussion, first and foremost. Freedom always, always, always. Government cannot take away our right to be productive. That's it. End it right there. Because once you make it about statistics, you're implying that politicians have the right to take away your freedom if a virus threatens enough. No, the more a virus threatens, the more politicians are superfluous. Really, who needs to be forced to be careful if something threatens you with hospitalization or death? We do not need politicians. They break things. They destroy jobs. They destroy businesses. They destroy lives. We saw it up close here, just all the harm they brought to tens of millions of Americans. Never again make it a freedom argument and nothing else.
Is it fair? Is it a fair argument to point to the number of people who've taken their own lives this year? Because the left will use that as a statistic in their gun violence argument all the time. But I would make the argument that the number of suicides this year this past 12 months have been enormously inflated by the lockdowns, and to make that almost something you point at the government officials and say, look at what you did versus what the virus did?
No, I think you're right. Look, I like making those arguments, and they're powerful. But I would always point out to people that I would have been against the lockdowns even if you could prove to me that suicides went down, even if you could prove to me what you can't, that lockdowns save lives.
Mm-hmm.
Government should not be taking away freedom, period. Anytime you make it about something else, you're implying that, well, if politicians can take away freedom in such a way that people are happy and will live their life and won't commit suicide, well, maybe lockdowns are okay. No, lockdowns are not okay. Taking the freedom and substituting the genius of the people for that of politicians is wrong. Always, always, always.
Well, I appreciate that, because we watch this vigor towards slapping down the gig economy. I mean, a lot of our small businesses only survive because of the gig economy, and entrepreneurs like DoorDash and even private folks and grocery stores have reinstituted delivery services and things like that. And we listen to folks like our Senator Mark Warner talking about regulating the gig economy to create a licensure and a regulation and creating gig economy unions and things like that. I'm like, my gosh, this was the only thing that really helped us get through this pandemic shutdown.
That's right. No, I mean, you hit on something that book talks about a lot. If not for the gig economy that they're trying to wreck, you couldn't have had the lockdowns in the first place. Now, let me be clear. I love the gig economy. I love progress, but certainly if the virus had started spreading 20 years ago, there's no way politicians could have taken away the freedom in the way that they did this time, which, again, I think speaks to the importance of we've got to make this an argument about freedom regardless of the other stuff, because progress will be the norm in the United States. Theoretically, 30 years from now, it will be even easier to lock down because so many people can work from anywhere. They can live there. No. Just don't take away our freedom. Don't take away our right to live as we want, ever.
Last one, we have about a minute and a half left. What about broadband? Broadband has become the new health care. Politicians say it, and maybe there aren't as many people pushing back on it because, when Paul says, oh, you're going to borrow from Peter to pay me, I'm fine with it. Is government broadband a necessity that needs to happen the way the politicians say it is in order to go forward into this post-COVID future?
No, of course not. And you and I know why. I mean, I think back to the best example I can come up with is I remember back in 1989, I went Christmas shopping with my dad and my sister for my mom in Beverly Hills in California. I grew up in California. And we saw some guy in the parking lot with this massive brick wireless phone.
Oh, yes.
And I was blown away. I thought, oh, wait, I've got to walk up close. This has got to be someone famous. Wow, he's got this phone. Well, nowadays we see no matter poor neighborhoods, rich neighborhoods, everyone's leaning over looking at a supercomputer in their hands. I don't know why that happened, but this is what capitalists do. They mass produce the former luxuries of the rich. If broadband is a market good that people want, why would we need a government program for it? We didn't have a supercomputer government program that provides for people. Why do we need it for broadband? Government should stay out. As a rule, it's creating access or a positive right or a right to yesterday's products and services. Entrepreneurs and businesses are creating the products and services of the future, tomorrow's. Who knows if broadband will be what we want a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Let entrepreneurs create the future, not governments. Don't allow governments to recreate the present in a very expensive and inefficient way.
God bless you. Have a great weekend. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for penning the book. Is Amazon usual suspects, or should they go to FreedomWorks to get the book directly?
Yep, it's available on Amazon, available on Barnes & Noble. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure and a privilege, and thank you for helping me, giving me a chance to tell my story.
Well, it's part of my free university education. It's a slow process, but the more people I talk to, the smarter I get. So I appreciate it, sir, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
As our founder, John Taylor, once said, until the phone company got deregulated, the only innovation they made was they went from a rotary dial to a touch push-button dialer. Then they deregulated it, and look at what happened. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. Till next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish, and thanks for all the fish, and thanks for all the fish, and thanks